Don't take. Well, good evening, everyone. It is a blessing to be with everyone on this wonderful evening. And so we are excited for the town hall that we're going to have on this evening as it relates to mental health. So we thank God for all of you who are on, those of you who are watching us via streaming, Facebook, YouTube. Just put your seatbelts on and we're going to have a wonderful time. It's going to be very informative. And I pray that as information comes forward, that it will be of a blessing and help to each of you. So I'm going to turn it over. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Bishop Bertrand Russell, pastor of Fountain of Life House of Worship, and I'm glad to lead such a wonderful, gifted, talented group of people. And so right now we're going to hear from the person who has coordinated this town hall, and that is none other than Sister Kim Gathers. And so Kim, it's yours. And I will come back later on if needed. But right now, you go ahead and take the realm.
Thank you, Bishop. Good evening, everyone. And first, I want to say thank you to Bishop and Sister Russell for providing the vision for the town halls and the opportunity for me to serve in this capacity. So May is Mental Health Awareness Month. And the purpose of this town hall and others to come is to hear from subject matter experts on pressing issues and critical topics, and allow the community to ask questions and hopefully leave with some information you didn't know. The format for this town hall is the moderator and the panelists receive questions ahead of time that they will initially focus on. There will be an opportunity at the end to ask questions during our Q&A. We ask that you put your questions in the chat to me, Kim Gathers, or if you feel more comfortable putting them to Bishop Russell, you can do that as well. All questions are anonymous and will be communicated to the speakers without names. We have a limited amount of time this evening, and we will do our best to get through as many questions as we can. To ensure everyone can hear the speakers in Zoom and those who are joining us on Facebook Live, I ask that you please put your device on mute at this time. I have the honor of introducing our moderator for this evening. Dr. Buffy Wooten is no stranger to the Fountain family, as she and her husband, attorney Robert Wooten, have been members for more than 15 years. Dr. Wooten is a clinical psychologist and clinical director of Wooten and Associates. She has been providing clinical counseling services to persons with substance abuse, traumatic histories, and criminal records for more than 30 years. So as you can see, she is well equipped to facilitate this conversation this evening. I will now turn it over to Dr. Wooten, and she will introduce our panelists. Dr. Wooten.
Hello. How are you? I guess I want to say, how are you guys? But you guys can't talk back to me. So most of you I do know, and I'm so glad to see you guys on the screen, and glad that you decided to take some time to participate in this conversation. And I'm sure that everybody has their own reasons for doing so. And hopefully I will be able to, we will all be able to answer those questions that you have about the topic. Thank you, Bishop and Lady J, for inviting us and opening up the space for us to have this conversation. it's going to be a short conversation, and this is a very broad topic, and it has a lot of emotional impact. So I expect that there will be things that will be left unsaid, and there will be questions that people still have. And of course, that's my husband's phone in the background. Everybody at Fountain knows how to reach me, and I will put my information in the chat if somebody needs to reach me afterwards. That was Sydney. Can you call back? Sorry, family disruption. So I'm going to introduce the speakers, and I'm going to let them tell you a little bit about their experience with the topic in particular, so that you know that they also are able to answer your questions and ready to do so tonight. So first we have Dr. Carlian Dawson, who is has her doctorate in educational leadership. Can you wave so everybody knows who you are? There she is, Carlian. And she is retired from the Rockford School District in Rockford, Illinois. And since then has been working as a director, used to work as the director of diversity at the University of Connecticut, and now is the director of education for the Arizona Center for African American Children, which is a think tank in Arizona to help us address these exact issues in our children and how they're showing up. In addition, we have Dr. Quebec Logan. Can you wave? There's Dr. Quebec. Some of you might know him. He is a local clinical psychologist. He owns his own private practice, and he has a dual degree in counseling and human systems. He also is a lead psychologist for the Tolleson School District and works for the NBA in their anti-drug program. So if Dr. Dawson, if you can start and just give us a little bit of an introduction to how you are experienced in the topic of trauma and resilience, and then we'll go to our question format.
Absolutely, Dr. Wooten. First of all, I want to thank everybody. I want to thank him for the invitation to be here tonight and participate in this town hall. It is really both my pleasure and my honor to be here. So thank you so much for asking me to be a part of this. I think there's nothing better than to inform our community about what's going on. What's going on in the world and what's going on with our families because of issues of trauma and the pandemic. Just to give you a little bit more background, again, I am a retiree out of Rockford, Illinois. I'm a native Arizonan, and we were gone for about 15 years, which took me back to Rockford, Illinois, and from Rockford over to Connecticut. My husband's job transferred us a lot. So when we came back here about 16 years ago, we've been home now for 16 years. I had a chance to, after I left the academia at the University of Connecticut, I came back here and got interested in something that had been a passion of mine for a long time, and that was early education. So I got into early education, and then the more I got into early education, looking at what was going on, there were so many, our little boys and girls, Black children were being expelled from kindergarten, and it troubled me tremendously. And so I started looking at as to what was going on and why, and came across two programs that I ended up being developers for, and it was for the ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences, with the ACEs Consortium here in Arizona. I'm a co-developer of that, and then a co-developer of, I went to another program. You guys may have heard of Dr. Bruce Perry. He and Oprah Winfrey have a book out now called What Happened to You? It's all about trauma, brain trauma. And he is my mentor. And I ended up going through a 4-year program with him, studying and working on trauma, what happens to us, how it happens, and why it happens. And it is really the ACEs program on steroids. So that's how I got into this trauma and this traumatic world and talking about it. And it really has opened up a lot of minds and hearts in school districts, as well as in businesses, about how trauma impacts us and how we respond to it. So thank you so much for allowing me to say that.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you. Dr. Logan.
Oh, well, thank you, Dr. Wooten. Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm Dr. Quebec Logan. I am a clinical psychologist here in Phoenix, as Dr. Wooten stated earlier. But how I got involved in understanding trauma and this topic. I'm originally from Philadelphia, and I am what we would typically consider the exception and not the rule, meaning I grew up in an impoverished neighborhood to two parents who were both drug addicts. Mother was a crackhead, father was a heroin addict. So I have pretty good firsthand knowledge of a lot of the things we would consider traumatic in growing up in those types of situations. So from both sides of the coin, if you will, from growing up in an impoverished neighborhood and having to deal with everything that comes along with that. And also to my academic training, over 25 years of schooling, from Lincoln University to Arizona State University to Florida State University, and directing a host of programs in between. I'm pretty well versed on the subject matter from an academic and a professional frame of reference.
Okay, so I'm going to put these two to the test. So I have a list of questions that we're going to go through, like Ms. Kimmy said, and if you have additional questions to that, then we're going to try and incorporate them. I want to start first by setting us up with some common understanding. So I want to give you the psychological definition of trauma, and then I'll say why that's important afterwards. So you may know that trauma has been studied by psychology for really not a really long time, probably about 60 years. What is this, 2020? Yeah, since the wars. When after the wars, when veterans were coming back and demonstrating these symptoms that were related to what they had witnessed when they were in combat, this is when psychology started to study trauma. And that was the early understanding that trauma was the result of a specific kind of exposure to a traumatic event. And at that time, our understanding was that trauma required that you personally had to be exposed to that traumatic event. And those events were limited in scope. But as psychology has evolved, it is now the understanding that traumatic events include not just military combat, but can also include actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence, either directly experienced by that person or witnessing someone else exposed to that situation, or even learning that such an event had occurred to someone close to them that they cared about. In addition, trauma is defined as being exposed to a repeated or extreme exposure and the aversive details of those events. For example, first responders, right? So first responders are repeatedly being exposed to the stories of and the impact of traumatic events that are impacting other people. But that experience of having to relive it and to detail it in their accounting of their workday is also known to be traumatic for certain people. So again, it's actual or threatened serious injury or death that can be qualified as trauma, or repeated and extreme exposure to harmful events. So you can imagine there's a host of things that meet this criteria for trauma now, right? The reason why this is important is because we have to be careful on how we use the term. Trauma has become so popular now that there's a group of us or a subset of people who tend to, I would say, maybe over apply the term trauma. That we are calling a lot of things, a lot of smaller impacting things, traumatic, when in fact they're not officially or psychologically considered traumatic. So they're not having the same significance of impact, but they are distressing and they are stressful. So there's a difference between stress and repeated stress or even chronic stress and something being traumatic. And we're going to talk, one of the things we're going to talk about is why that differentiation becomes important in responding to people in our communities and our environments. But the opposite is also a problem. That sometimes opposite to over applying the label, we can also minimize the label or dismiss it or neglect to acknowledge that something that is traumatic to one person is not necessarily traumatic to another person.
Right.
So someone may go through a divorce, and for them, that divorce is stressful, difficult, complicated, but they are able to manage it. They're able to continue to function in their daily life, and there's not a major disruption in their ability to stay in a regulated space. But for another person, divorce can be significantly traumatic. Their whole world can be caving in. All of the regulatory factors that happen that help a person sustain their life can be disrupted, and their children and the impact of those changes in their life can become very traumatic and change the way they see the world and change the way they respond to the situations in their life. So in that case, you have two different people who respond to a similar situation in very different ways. And so it's really important to recognize that you have to interpret trauma based on the individual that you're talking to and the experience of that individual and the impact of the situation on that individual. So that means that one definition or one application of the term cannot be broadly applied to every single person in the situation.
Mm-hmm.
So that is trying to help you understand from the beginning. There is a window, or maybe, yeah, a window, where something happening in this range of the window is stressful, but then there's another level where that thing can turn into a traumatic experience. And the traumatic experience can be recognized by the way the person interprets that event and how much that event disrupts their regular functioning. So I'm sure everybody's heard about the diagnosis of PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. And everybody who goes through a traumatic experience does not have PTSD. Some people can go through a traumatic experience, but they don't develop the long-lasting demonstration of symptoms related to that traumatic experience. So for example, I've had clients who have been sexually assaulted, and some of those clients develop PTSD. They have the symptoms of heightened anxiety, flashbacks, dreams, avoiding certain situations and places because it reminds them of what happened, and then they become very dysregulated. But I've also had clients who have been sexually assaulted, who had great support systems intact. They rationalized exactly what happened and how much was their responsibility and what was the responsibility of the perpetrator. And that person may not have developed those symptoms or long-lasting symptoms of having been traumatized. It was a trauma, but they don't necessarily develop the symptoms of a problem that we call a disorder called PTSD. So you can have a trauma and still not demonstrate that long-term effect of PTSD. Write down your questions if you have questions so that we can answer them if I'm not being clear about something. So, The other thing I just wanted to say to introduce us to this subject matter today is that this is why it becomes so very important that everywhere you go and every person you come in contact with, you are careful and sensitive to the possibility that this person may have had a traumatic experience. We're calling this now trauma-informed care or trauma-informed organizational culture, where everyone in the organization, this is for churches and corporations and public and governmental agencies, that everybody in the organization needs to be sensitive to the fact that, for statistical purposes, approximately 20 to 25% of people in the general population seek therapy for something. And if only 25% seek therapy, there's a greater number that need it but don't seek it, right? 80% of people who seek therapy have had a traumatic experience. So the incidence, the likelihood, the chance that somebody that you're running into or having a relationship with or working with, having had some traumatic experience, especially in this day and age and the things we've been going through, the chances of them having been through a traumatic experience are very high. And you don't know, we don't know what is the trigger for that person. So it behooves us to be sensitive. Now, this is what Christ called us to do anyway, to be kind, to be considerate, to be unoffensive, to be loving in all the ways that we interact with people. But we get irritable and we don't always do that. But the truth is that our behavior impacts all those around us. And so for you to come to a basic understanding that this is what trauma is, this is how it can affect people and how it affects their interaction with everyone else. We have the opportunity to be a healer or to be an agitator. And so we should choose with knowledge and wisdom to be a healer, to not be an agitator, to not accidentally or unintentionally aggravate someone's experience. So that's my hope for you today, that you'll participate in the healing process rather than the agitating process. Okay, I need to be quiet. I'm going to let Dr. Logan, if you would, please help us understand what resilience is. Let's start with that. We're not only talking about just trauma, but we want to also bring in resilience. So if you could help us with that.
Sure. So in a nutshell, in kind of the basic form, resilience is the ability to adapt to adversity, in the simplest form. It's one's ability to adapt to a challenging situation in a positive fashion, right? Because we all adapt to situations that are challenging, some more positively adapt than others. So resilience is your ability to adapt to an adverse situation in an appropriate and positive fashion.
Mm-hmm. And there's another concept I want to introduce, and that is protective factors, and how protective factors lead us to resilience. Can you, Dr. Dawson, tell us about that?
I sure can. But if I can, I'd like to go back for just a moment and add to, you gave such a beautiful description and definition of what trauma is. And I just wanted to add Dr. Perry, who is a international sequential neurologist, not neurologist, brain scientist, that I just want to add a piece of this to that. And that trauma it can be a psychological, as you stated, emotional, physical, and spiritual wound to someone. And when that wound happens, the Native Americans call it, they say that it's a wounding to the soul, because this wound can be so deep that it actually begins a slow death process in us if we are not careful and understand it and can come to people like you, Dr. Wooten, and Dr. Logan, who can really help us and work through that trauma. So I just wanted to add that. And I also want to say this. Some of the things that you're going to hear us talk about, we want to make sure that you understand it can be challenging to hear. This can be challenging. It can be difficult, but it can make you feel sad about some of the things you hear, and people start to regret and thinking, oh, I wish I could have, should have, that I want to make sure you understand that that's not our goal to make you feel that way. We want to make sure, to shame you, we're not trying to do anything like that, but we want to make sure that you understand that when trauma happens, help help is coming, and that trauma is caused by relationships with people, and also trauma is healed by relationships with people. And saying that, looking at the protective factors that Dr. Wooten asked me to address, this is important for us to understand that these protective factors, there are 5 of them out of SAMHSA, and they talk about social and emotional competence of children. We've got to make sure that our children are socially and emotionally competent. And how they do that is how we work with them and talk with them in our families, how we help them understand, and if they are, and not expecting too much of them or too little of them. Both of those can cause issues, and that we provide support for our children. And I know as a principal, people will bring their babies to school, and they were like be 4 years old, and they say, oh, my baby can read, my baby can say their ABCs, say your ABCs. The baby start reciting their ABCs, and they say they can count, and the baby start counting. But what they didn't understand is that these were just songs to the children. They were just songs. You can tell children are good at memorizing songs, and those things are just songs. What people actually look at is social emotional development in children. And that social emotional development says that they are ready to follow directions. They are ready to stop something and or start something. And you give them a little test on stopping play or starting play with children, and you can see, and parents walking in or out of the room, you can see those children and how they respond if they were ready to be in school. So that social emotional development, helping children understand and be regulated. And they really learn that regulation. That is, how do I control my emotions? And they learn that from their parents. And if we as parents aren't modeling that, then our children aren't going to learn it. Dr. Logan talked about resilience. Parental resilience is a second one. How do parents cope with everyday life? How do they get through stuff? How do they, when you don't have something, how do you fix that? Resilience is not the absence of emotions. It's not feeling uncaring or not having any feelings of pain or anything. It is sometimes you have to cry, you have to shout, you have to grieve, but it's not forever. It's not forever. And sometimes it takes time to do those things. And we have to look at how resilient are we on a daily basis. How are we looking at, when you start rebuilding what was broken, or how do you regain happiness after a relationship didn't go so well? Or how do you survive and heal after a major setback? These are things that we look back when it comes to resilience. What keeps you going? So that's another one. The third one is social connections. Who's in your circle? Parent, who do you call on when you need advice? Who do you call on when you need help? Who is there to listen free to you and give you some support? That's critical. We all need to have somebody, big mama them, somebody to call on, to go to to help us when we need some support. Because as much as we like to think that we can do it all, sometimes we just can't do it all. And we just need somebody to help us through that. And who do you have as a sympathetic and an empathetic learner? Somebody to give you advice and some concrete support in a time of need. And as a matter of fact, that's the fourth one, that concrete support in a time of need. Again, identifying resources. Where can you go for help when you need some? When all else has failed, when there's no money coming in, when there's no support, or jobs are lost, where do you go for help? And for that, in our community, a lot of times we can go to the church and get some help and figure out that will help us get through all those things. So, and then the fifth one is the understanding, having knowledge of how your children grow and develop. That knowledge of parenting and child development. We need to know our children thrive, and when parents learn, and I do a parenting classes, and I think about if I could call it something different other than a parenting class, because parents hate coming to parenting classes. They don't want to do that. They want so. But these are not parenting classes that tell you what you've done wrong, because all of us have made mistakes. These are classes that show you some different things. How do you do some things different? But that understanding child development, what your children are supposed to be able to do at certain ages is critical. And understanding how the first 2 months of life, are the most critical times in our life. And based on how we are nurtured in those first 2 months, the rest of our 85 years or so is based off of that. And it's just amazing that such little time being nurtured. And you can take a family, a child who's been in a wonderful environment those first 2 months, and then something happens to their family and they go into foster care, and the foster family isn't a good family. But that child will more than likely, they may have some ups and downs, but the propensity of them doing well over time is higher than if a child who had a rough 2 month start and going to a great family has. Well, those are the 5 areas.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Dawson. I want to just capture that and encapsulate that a little bit. So the point that I want to make sure everybody takes away from those 2 definitions is that there are things that happen early in our life that have the potential to set in motion how strong our ability to recover and sustain the traumatic wound in our future life will be. In other words, as Dr. Dawson was saying, in our early childhood years, if we have a safe, secure environment, it certainly does help us to have more resilience later. That's protecting us from a vulnerability later. I think the other important point is that there are still things we can do if in our early childhood we did not have such a secure and safe environment that help to build resilience in our life moving forward. And those things we can do at any time in our life, and we can be more intentional and more conscientious about doing them intentionally in order to strengthen our ability to resist and protect ourselves against the impact of trauma moving forward. So there are protective factors that can happen early in childhood and throughout childhood and early adulthood that help us to have less vulnerability to trauma, but there are things that we can do intentionally that improve our ability to be resilient, more successes, and we're going to talk about that also later. What are the things that we do that build resilience internally that make us less vulnerable to trauma. Okay, is that fair? So I want to go back to how we characterize traumatic experiences and how that impacts our sense of self and who we are in our community and in our culture. So I want to ask Dr. Logan, if you were to help us understand why traumatizing some of our experiences helps to validate what we're going through, and how we use that recognition with each other, having gone through similar traumas like racial injustice and the pandemic, how we use that to identify and to associate with one another and the risks and benefits of that.
Right.
Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so I think you just answered your own question, right? So we traumatize
Oh,
our
I did it. No.
so we traumatize our experience as a way to normalize it, right? And make those connections with other people, right? Which is exactly what you just said in a nutshell. So by traumatizing our experiences, we can normalize that experience. And through normalization of that experience, we can make those connections with other individuals that may have also had similar experiences. And when you make those sort of connections, that's one of the things that Dr. Dawson was saying, in building that support network, right? So you make those connections, you build that support network, and then you're able to, again, work on your resiliency to overcome whatever traumatic experience that is, right? So that can, as you alluded to as well, have positive and negative benefits. So the positive benefits, we just talked about the normalization and build the ability to begin to work on and cultivate resilience to overcome whatever that traumatic experience is. But the negative piece of that might be, the lack of individualization of your traumatic experience, right? What we started off with, over traumatizing everything, thinking because somebody else feels traumatized by an experience and you've had a similar experience, I should feel that way too, or why don't I feel that way, right? And feeling guilty about that. Well, for example, I'll give a little personal example. My grandmother passed away some time ago and I didn't cry, right? I didn't cry. And I love my grandmother to death. I loved her. And I questioned, well, if you loved her, why didn't you cry? When people's grandmother die or someone they love die, they typically cry. Because why? That's a traumatic experience, right? So I was young when this happened. So I'm having this conversation with myself, like, well, did you really love her? Why aren't you crying? But that experience was so different for me than it had been for some people I know that had a similar experience, and they really went through a lot of challenges and emotional ups and downs. My grandmother had bone marrow cancer, so she was in a lot of pain constantly. So when she passed away, it was a relief to me to see that she was no longer in such pain, that they had no medication or nothing that they can give her to help her through that, right? So while it was a traumatic experience, I didn't experience the trauma in the same way that a lot of other people might experience a similar traumatic event, right? So that could be the negative, thinking you need to feel a certain way, or questioning, why don't I feel this way when this traumatic thing happened to me? When you might not necessarily, you might have more protective factors, as we talked about. You might be more resilient, as we discussed. And so therefore you deal with the trauma in a more appropriate, productive manner than somebody that may not have as many protective factors or might not be as resilient. So those are some of the positives and the negatives of kind of, normalizing our traumatic experiences.
Mm-hmm. And you brought up something else that I think is very important too, is how relational we really are. That much of what we think about ourselves and how we judge ourselves is based on how we compare ourselves to others, and how we're looking at other people's experience, and we take that information in as if that's the gauge. And in some cases it is, and that is how we learn. but at the same time, being a self-assured person and having the experience of self-validation, I can acknowledge that I'm having an experience, even if that might be different from other people's normal or what people might expect. And that can be true and authentic for me. And that kind of confidence is also part of building resilience. I think that's super important. And a lot of times that comes up in counseling, that you do have your own experience, and that itself is valid. And sometimes we need other people to help us see that and acknowledge it, and then help figure out, okay, then what, right? What do I do with that? If that's valid and it's okay, how do I move forward? I
Absolutely.
think people do get stuck right there.
And
So,
you know, and you know, adding to it, when we have kiddos, children, and they are having a hard time, you mentioned getting stuck. They have a hard time getting through traumatic moments. The one thing that we can help our kids out with, in addition to the self-regulation, being regulated and in control of their emotions, is giving them the words to speak. We have to give them and teach them terms and feelings. They need to understand that, because what I've experienced and found is that when children don't have the word capacity to speak out, the anger, they get angrier faster, and they fight quicker. And so, but when you have the ability to talk about what you're experiencing, it gives you, now you have a vehicle to express how you feel. And we find that there's a lot of research on that, and it shows you that our children, every child needs to hear, by the time they're 3 years old, 30 million words. 30 million. And that breaks down to over 2,000 words an hour that professional families speak to their children. And when you have someone who was not someone who may be in poverty and having struggles, and the vocabulary may not be as high, or they speak in more commanding language, like do this, eat this, go to bed, get up, like that. They find that the number of words per hour rate somewhere around 900. And you think about that, the number of words coming in when a child goes to school, if that's all they hear, and then they get to a classroom and the teacher is asking them questions, and number one, and that teacher looks nothing like them, because most of our children will go to school, and most of our children will never have the experience of having one African-American teacher, which is a whole nother issue on trauma. Never had the experience of one African-American teacher. When that happens, they ask them a question and that child can't respond as fast as they want. Then the child gets upset and angry because they're not responding, and they may strike out, or they may behaviorally say some things, and it sets a trajectory of dysregulation for the student and the teacher and the entire classroom.
okay, well, I have to jump in there and say that's true for adults too. That adults with impoverished language don't have good words for how they feel, don't use their language very well to ask to get their needs met, also have the same difficulty, right, interpersonally. When they're in relationship with people, they tend to be impulsive and they tend to be frustrated because people are not understanding their needs, and they have a difficult time communicating that. And that creates a very volatile, potentially, and dysregulated scenario for adults too. So it's not too late. It's not, this is
It's
something
never
I've
too
worked
late.
on a lot.
It is
It's
never too late.
for you to
It's never too
improve
late.
your ability to communicate yourself
Exactly.
to other people. And that is going to help you regulate your emotion, especially after traumatic experience, because that's what therapy is putting words on your experience and having someone witness that with you and validate you in real time. So that is such an important point. Language from the beginning all the way through your life. And in particular, in response to a traumatic experience, language is so important.
And if I can just add one more point in that, and that is, if we have the ability, if we start talking to our children in more open sentences and questions and asking, giving our kids a chance to make choices. And that is, instead of saying, this is what you're eating, you know the range. If you've got hot dogs and you've got cheese sandwiches, you don't ask them if they want a hamburger. You ask them, would you like a hot dog or a cheese sandwich? And let them make that decision. Helping children make decisions also help them later on in life too. Because then they start a trajectory of understanding that I can decide to do something. Without that, our children still, again, they get lost in the system because now they go to school and they can't make choices.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to move us forward. We identified 3 potentially traumatic circumstances of our current life and situation that we wanted to at least touch on. And the first one I want to bring up is the experience of going through this pandemic and the social/physical distancing and isolation that we've all been participating in. And the question I want to ask is, if one of you can speak to the unique impact of isolation in the name of social distancing for us. What has been the impact of that? What do we need to be thinking about as we reintroduce ourselves socially to each other? And what cautions we might need to keep in mind moving forward?
You want to take it, Dr. Dawson?
Well, I'll start, and you certainly, I know, can clean up on the back end of this. So,
Absolutely.
so you know, when the country announced that we were in an epidemic, the Black community was already in a pandemic. We were running behind on everything that was good and ahead on everything that was bad. And so, this pandemic exposed what was going on in our lives. Without this pandemic, what happened to George Floyd, in my belief, would never have been as obvious. But because individuals were hurting, they were in trauma, because the environment also causes trauma. You know, if you have like in New Orleans, they had the flooding, that environmental issue causes trauma. In Michigan, they have the bad water, that environment causes trauma, and illness behind all of this, because with trauma comes stress, and with stress comes disease, and with disease comes death. And so, but this trauma, this pandemic exposed all of that, and it put us in a playing field where people could see, because they were hurting, what was going on. And this is
getting to the reintroducing part. What do we need to be wary of? What do we need to be mindful of as we re-engage, and the impact of that on us now?
And what I believe we want to look at now, how this is impacting us, is we've got to make sure that, because the suicide rate is just going higher for our children, and we've got to make sure that we are hearing their voices, talking with them, being engaged with them, because without that, without them talking to us and us engaging with them, we are creating a greater divide with them. We've got to make sure that when our kids tell us something, that we hear exactly what they're saying about that and not discounting it. We've got to make sure that all that has happened with our children in the school, not being in school, that has been a big issue. Food insecurity, there are families that didn't have food. So, and the school was where the children got at 2 meals, breakfast and lunch. So we've got to make sure that when they're coming back together again, that our kids feel safe, because not feeling safe in that school causes problems. And going back because of this, we've been talking about social distancing, and how we got to stay away from each other. That was one of the biggest mistakes I think we made. And let me say why, because I don't want you to think I'm saying don't social distance. What I'm saying is instead of social distancing, there should be a physical distancing and social engagement. That's the other side of it.
Okay, great. I'm going to give Dr. Logan a chance to answer that.
Sure. So one of the biggest impacts I've seen of kind of social isolation, social distancing and isolation is depression, right? A lot of people that are seeking mental health services are coming in for depression and anxiety because they have been isolated for well over a year now. They haven't had the opportunity to access some of those things that help protect us from traumatic experiences, right? We haven't had an opportunity to access the gym, because physical fitness is a protective factor. If you're physically fit and you feel good physically, when you encounter something that's traumatic, you're better able to deal with that because physically you're feeling better, right? So that isolation has taken a lot of that away because why? Gyms are closed. A lot of people had gym memberships. I myself canceled my gym membership that I had for 3 years. Never went, but I still had the membership and I canceled it, right? Because that was no longer an option. Not having the opportunity to engage with the people that we love, to engage in social circles, to engage in sororities, fraternity, church, not having the opportunity to do that. Church, we talked about this in preparing for this discussion. Church, in a lot of ways, has been the go-to for people of color for mental health services, right? Or for help, period, when they have a traumatic event. So having that taken away because we had to isolate from one another makes it very, very difficult to combat traumatic experiences and actually creates another traumatic experience, right? Because now you don't have that outlet. You don't have access to the pastor. You don't have access to the congregation. You don't have access to the facility itself, because sometimes just being there is uplifting and fulfilling and helps you overcome a challenging day, a difficult situation, a job loss, a divorce, or whatever the case might be. So increases in depression we've seen from being isolated, increases in anxiety. People are anxious about going outside, about going to see their parents, just doing a visit, about hugging their children if they work in a high needs area or an area that's where they're likely to come into contact with a lot of people. So now if you work in a hospital or something, we've seen nurses hug their children through plastic bags because they don't want to, run the risk of their children contracting COVID. So those are some of the effects of the isolation. What do we need to do what do we need to do to be mindful when we reconnect? Well, what are some of the things we need to be mindful of when we reconnect? I think one of the things that we need to be mindful of, going back to what Dr. Dawson said, is ensuring that we're not so much focused on the social distance, but the physical distance, right? So you want to distance physically, meaning keep your circle of friends small, keep the circle of people that you interact with small, but if at all possible and in any ways possible, increase the amount that you socialize while physically distancing, because the social piece is the piece the lack of being able to socialize is the thing that's contributing to the increase in depression and anxiety and things like that. So how can you increase being social when you have to physically distance, right? Technology is a wonderful thing. We have, upwards to 30 people on this call right now, and we're all being social. We're all engaging in this town hall. So using technology to increase social engagement is a wonderful thing. Planning things. If you're at home and you can't go out, maybe technology isn't a big thing and you have family at home. planning times where you and your family can sit down together to engage, to talk about what's going on, to talk about how people's feeling, to talk about what people are feeling, to talk about how to best negotiate the current pandemic and their feelings, right? So planning that time out. If you don't have anybody you live with and you live by yourself, reaching out and engaging in other groups. A lot of times we think we're the only ones having a particular experience, right? I get clients. I have an Asian Pacific Islander client, and he came because he was really starting to feel the pressure of all the violence going on towards Asians, and he really thought that he was the only one that was experiencing that here in Arizona. I said, well, I don't think so. Reach out. There's groups of people like you that have the same experience. So reach out, find those groups. I had another young lady from Israel. She was going through things just understanding what's going on there. And she thought, I'm in America, I don't really have any connections like that. But lo and behold, there's 5 or 6 groups right here in Arizona that she was able to contact, to build those connections with, to build those bridges, to help her negotiate the traumatic experiences. So that's what we need to be mindful of, that we're increasing our social connections while, decreasing the increasing the physical distancing and the social connections as well. So we want to be physically distanced, but we also want to make sure that we're cultivating those social connections while we're doing that.
So I want to add too that just because we've gotten permission from on high that we can reintegrate, that depression and anxiety is not going to go away right away, right?
Mm-mm.
That one of the things we might need to be mindful of is that you're still going to have some depression and anxiety if that's been your experience. And as you get out into the world, I was reading an article this week that said that, if I can find the stat right here, that said that there's a disproportionate impact on communities of colors, that Black Americans were more likely to report concerns about the future and not feeling comfortable going back to living life like they used to before the pandemic. 54% of African Americans said they're already saying, I don't know if I'm gonna be comfortable going back out like I was. And that tells you that there's going to be some ambivalence, some anxiety, some hesitancy, some concern, some feeling unsafe, which means more people are going to be vulnerable to the physical space violations that we typically encounter out in the world, and other kinds of insults that might trigger, I need to go back in the house. I'm not coming back outside, right? So we need to be mindful that there's going to be a residual of some of these symptoms that we've been having and the interpretations of what's safe and what's not safe as we move out into society again. So let's be careful about that.
Dr. Buffy, can I add something to that?
Yeah.
We're talking about Fountain is going to be reopening on June the 6th, the first Sunday in June. And I'm already hearing from people who've been vaccinated that I'm not coming back to church. You will probably never see me again. And so I'm like, where is this coming from? And so as we're speaking, there's some things that's going on internally. So can you kind of hit on that and maybe kind of give us some insight on that? Because they still go to work, they still do other things in their lives, but for some of these people, there's something about the church environment that I'm not sure is most comfortable for them since we've gone through this period of time.
Yeah. Well, for somebody who's going to work, but maybe doesn't feel comfortable going to church, I could understand that in one way. You have to talk to the person to find out for sure if this is what they're thinking. But the church doesn't have good boundaries. We're people in church, we hug all on each other. We don't even know you, we hugging on you. We're smiling at you, we get all close, we share space. Our seats are very close to each other. There's no cubicles, there's no like order really. And I think that can contribute to anxiety. And we don't have assigned seats. You come in and you kind of fumble in and find a place to get where you feel safe, but you don't have control over the people that sit next to you and how close they are, and trying to tell ushers, I'm not doing that. I could see where that might cause a little bit of anxiety. That'd be something for pastors to take into account as people are re-entering into that space. That the experience of church before was definitely not pandemic friendly. So that might be something that people are having trouble with. But maybe there's other things you guys might see that for people who are not necessarily working, but just afraid and anxious about coming out in social groups anyway.
Dr. Wooten, you make such a good point. And furthermore, there are a lot of churches who are assigning places to sit and establishing like the CDC has a protocol of how close you sit with those individuals. So it may not be at full capacity, just to give individuals the comfort and feeling safe about coming back into the house of God again. So that helps them also. And then, having those sanitary stations set up so that people can come in and, wash their hands with the sanitizers and just feel a sense of safetyness, as Dr. Wooten has stated earlier.
If I could speak on just for a second, I think, the church is experiencing, what the workplace is experiencing too, right? Because a lot of people are not wanting to go back to work either. They're choosing to stay home. A lot of people, myself included, right? I've never did teletherapy ever, because I believe the secret sauce was being face-to-face in my office. I've always believed that my whole career. If I can get you in my office, we can do some work. All this computer stuff, my feelings and sentiments about it has totally changed since I've been doing teletherapy over the past year. I have not seen one client in the brand new office I just moved into and pay rent for every month. I refuse to go back at this point. So I think one of the things we're all going to have to look at, particularly organizations like churches and corporations and things, is ways in which to expand our idea about where work is, where church is, where our church home, right? Is it a physical building, or can we utilize technology and some other means to expand our reach to draw those people back in to what we're doing? Maybe not necessarily in the church, but in other capacities. Maybe not necessarily in the office, but in other capacities. So getting creative about how do we adapt to the changes that are coming, that are here now and that are coming, because a lot of things we're simply never, in my opinion, going to go back to. Blowing out candles on birthday cakes and everybody cutting them and eating them. Right?
Okay, but I have to contend with you on that, because while I didn't really do teletherapy before either, and I'm doing it, maybe 70-80% now, I really still do believe that there is something different about being in the presence of a person. There's so much more information and so much more, as we call affective presence in the presence of people. And I feel super sad about people not feeling comfortable being around other people, because even if I keep my quarters close and I stay within my small circle or my large circle, I have the same people I interact with all the time, I'm going to suffer consequence in my emotional, social, intellectual, and spiritual health by not interacting in person with people. My language skills, my nonverbal skills are not going to be as attuned to people. And I think that's going to have a long-term consequence. I get the convenience. Yes, we have to figure that out. Access to so much more resource has been vital for so many people. But I'm really encouraging people, you are going to need human touch. You're going to need human interaction. And that especially in the face of trauma and recovering from trauma, there's nothing that compares to the physical touch when you are crying in pain and you are racking with the Lord about something or about some other stress in your life, or when the family situation is too dramatic, I got to have somewhere to go where somebody can hold on to me and let me know everything is going to be okay. So yes, you know, this is tough for us to figure this out in this time. Oh, I have to say this. Could you, no, I'm not going to say that, but go ahead.
Dr. Wooten, can you hear me?
Yes.
So we have 5 minutes. I want to make
yes.
sure I don't see any questions coming in. And I know that you all have another area that we need to touch on.
Yes.
So,
thank you.
Bishop, do you have any questions on your end?
No, but let's extend it to 10 minutes. We'll go to 8:15.
Okay. Let me move to the next
Before you go,
subject.
Dr. Wooden, can I just make a comment about touch, how important that is? Because I mean, you're so correct in what you're saying. As a matter of fact, of our 5 senses, touch is the most important. We can live without all the other senses, but the only sense we can't live without is touch. And people will gravitate toward bad touch over no touch.
Yes.
So that is absolutely critical. And then in the churches where we had a lot of touching going on, good touch going on. And that is critical for us as a people to survive. Thank you.
Thank you. So I know we're running out of time. I knew this was going to happen, so we're not surprised. But we did want to make a leap over to the topic of the racial injustice and environment that we have also lived through as a traumatic experience individually, as our smaller community, and as our culture, as a whole. We have all been exposed to this incredulous trauma in the United States about race. There's so many things we can talk about. Let me just start with you, Dr. Logan, and ask you to speak to the relationship, if you can, concisely, the relationship between racial injustice and mental health. Trying to keep it streamlined to
Okay.
traumatic experience and the impact on our mental health.
Dr. Logan, before you get started, I'm
Yes.
going to give us a little leeway here because this is a real important topic that we're getting ready to deal with. So we'll have a little leeway as far as the time is concerned.
Okay. So the relationship is negative, right? So the more racial injustice you experience, the more negative your experience is going to be. The more negative your emotions will be, the more likely you'll get depressed, the more likely you'll be anxious when you get stopped by a police officer or when you come in contact with law enforcement. So as one increases, the other decreases. The less racial injustice you experience, the less likely you are to be, depressed or anxious or develop any of those kind of negative symptoms that are associated with that sort of experience. Concisely.
That was excellent. You did good on that. I just want to highlight that the relationship affects the mental health symptoms and disorders that you can associate with the experience of racism include, right? Depression, anxiety, PTSD, which we talked about, substance use, for sure, and other addictions.
I think we can include a host of things. I mean, I think we can rattle off a list because it's so insidious, and racism and social injustice touches us in so many ways, on so many levels, on a daily basis, that it can create all sorts of psychological and mental health challenges. One thing I do want to say about that while we're touching on that, I think we need to be mindful about how much we engage with social injustice or social justice material, right? How much videos you watch of police murdering Black folks, how many times you engage in conversations about the topic. Because as you spoke to earlier, Dr. Wooten, these things, even though it's not you who the event happened to, you can still have the same physical and psychological and emotional experiences as if it were you who
Yes.
Vicariously.
experience happened to, right? So being mindful of how much we allow that type of material into our psychological space, being mindful about how much we watch the news, understanding that it's okay to cut that stuff off and kind of tune out for a minute for your own. Not only is it okay, it's imperative that we cut that stuff off and tune out for a minute for our own mental health and psychological well-being.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, this the mental state that people go through, this state dependence of cognition, how we think, and when you think about this, when you think on a level of there's as a baseline, if in order for me to be to feel safe and can address issues using the higher part of my brain, I've got to feel calm about that. And then if I'm calm, I can reach that higher order thinking, I can reflect, I can do things. And the functional IQ in that is somewhere between 120 and 100. So we can think, and as long as we feel safe, okay, and we've satiated, and just things are well, we've slept well, all those things are good. We go on a more hypervigilant, we become more hypervigilant and call at an alert state when something happens. For example, like when you go to work, and if there's nobody there that looks like you, that makes you feel some kind of way. Okay, and it's like there's a little adjustment you got to make to it. Or if you walk into a room and everybody stops talking, it's like there's an adjustment you go through. And that right there causes you get an alert state, and you may not be able to think as clearly as you could when you're in calm, because you won't be, but you can think. Somebody want to introduce a new concept to you, you might be able to pick it up, but you might not be able to hold it. But your functional IQ might be like between 110 and 80. You can, but then you're a little bit more focused. And then when you get to alarm, and that's where you are more emotional about things that are going on. Something has happened to you and you're emotional. Let's say you get fired, you're emotional. Okay, you can't think now because you think I got my family to feed, I got my rent to pay, I've got all these things to do, and now I don't have a job, or you get laid off, and now I don't have a job, and now that functional IQ has come down to like between 90 and 60, and what that again, you are more emotional, and you're using your limbic system and talking about and working, trying to think, but you can't think, because you're looking at what's going on right now. And then when you get to fear, and that fear is your reactive, something has happened and it's caused you to be fearful about what's going on. And now you are in that brain stem, and this is total reactive. And now your thinking capacity is somewhere, your functional IQ thinking is somewhere between 70 and 50. And it's just like, you cannot really think clear unless somebody come and try to ask you to do something, or someone try to show you how to do something. You can't, because you can't think about how to get to that. We need, and I believe, and this is truly a Carlianism here, I believe that African Americans pre-pandemic were walking around on our best days in an alert mode, because we were always cautious of where we were and what we do and what we said. And I think it's gotten a little lower since then. But that's research that Dr. Perry does. That's not me, that's Dr. Perry stuff. And he talks about that. And so I just wanted to share that with you.
Thank you.
Dr. Wooten, we have
yes.
5 minutes.
Okay.
And then we have one question, but go ahead.
You have a question for me?
There's a question, but you all may touch on it. So they wanted some techniques that they can use
Yes.
to calm down when engaged or pulled over by the police.
Okay, so I was getting ready to turn us toward, in our last 3 to 5 minutes, what are the things we would recommend to help people to manage this vulnerability to being reactive because of the traumas we've already experienced, which would also make us vulnerable to new traumas, right?
Mhm, mhm.
So that, I think that doesn't come to your question. Kim, I'm gonna, we only have let's imagine we have 3 minutes.
A minute, a
Okay,
minute each.
let's imagine we have 3 minutes. So I'm gonna let you, Dr. Dawson, do one, and Dr. Logan, you got one, and then I have one, and we're gonna try and wrap this up.
And I'm going to quickly say self-care. We've got to take care of ourselves. We've got to make sure that we put ourselves first in taking care of ourselves. If you don't take care of yourself, you can't take care of your children. You can't take care of your spouse. There's nothing you can do for them if you are not healthy. So you've got to make sure that you get plenty of sleep. You got to make sure you eat right. You got to make sure you exercise. Those are the things that are important, that are critical for you. And yes, it's okay to get your hair did. It's okay to get your nails done. Those things are fine. But more importantly is eating well, sleeping well, and exercising, taking care of yourself. And when I ask parents that, who do you take care of? Who's more important to take care of, you or your children? They inevitably say, my children. But by the time we finish class, they understand how they've got to be first. It's like, put that mask on yourself in the airplane, put it on yourself first, and then your child. Your child can't take care of you.
Okay.
Did I stand on my 1 minute?
I actually wasn't timing you, but yes. Okay. Dr. Logan.
Okay, so I'll speak to the question that was asked,
Okay.
that was asked. What can you do if you get stopped by the police, right? That's the basic question. The first thing I would say is make sure you're in a mindset that you want to get home, right? So get home. That's your first thought. I want to get home. That means I'm not going to argue. I'm not going to be confrontative. I'm not going to talk about, this is illegal and all of that. If you want to do those things and you feel like you're being treated unfairly, fight in court. You will not win a fight with the police on the side of the road. You won't, and you might get shot, particularly if you're a person of color, male, female, or child. It does not matter. So your first thought should be, I want to get home. How can I make it home? Number two, have your credentials ready before the cops. I just got pulled over by the police about 3 weeks ago. Before I stopped my car, I reached into my glove compartment, pulled out all my credentials, and when I pulled over, had my credentials in my hand. Why did I do that? Because I don't want him to think I'm reaching for something in my glove box when I'm just reaching for my registration, right? And give him an excuse to get agitated, get fearful, or anything like that. So before I pulled over my car, I started going to my glove box, got my paperwork out, pulled over after I had my paperwork in my hand, and had it in my hand when he pulled up because I knew he was going to ask for it. And that way I just handed it to him. So that's number two. Number three, don't ask no questions. Okay? Please don't ask no questions. Unless don't ask no questions, just answer whatever they ask you. If they ask you something, answer the questions. Refrain from asking questions or making any comments. The cop said something to me. He said, well, you was going 93, but I'm gonna make the ticket for 80 miles an hour. I said, I appreciate that. He said, what? Right? Automatically. Right? Because he didn't necessarily hear what I said. He didn't hear what I said. And I immediately recognized that he got kind of snappy because I said, I appreciate that. So now my thought is, don't even say nothing. Let them say what they're going to say, answer their questions. Okay. So my frame is to get home, have your documents ready before you pull over. Don't ask no questions. Fight in court if you need to fight.
Dr. Logan, I have a lot of work to do.
Hey man, get it done.
I would just add in closing that to build your resilience, absolutely, please take care of yourself. That includes your emotional health, your mental health, which is what you practice in your thought life, your physical health, like Dr. Dawson mentioned, and your spiritual health, and making sure that you're being fed and that you're growing and that you have more strength inside of you to pull from when you're in a difficult situation than you had before. You just keep doing it every day. I would love to be able to say more to you about the practice of mindfulness, that when you are in a situation, whether it is potentially traumatic or whether it is stressful, and also when it is joyful, it's important for you to be most keenly aware of what's going on with you, that you're paying attention to your heart rate, to your thoughts, to how you're feeling and what your body is doing, so that you can make the decision about what your next best step is going to be. Then you're not blindsided by, or you're not hijacked, we say, by your emotions, that you can act wisely in every situation. And I think that's going to be your best skill in all those situations. Okay, Bishop.
Okay. So let me jump just before Bishop gets on. So if you all can, I know that was your closing, but one of the things, because you talked about resilience, right? And so we have a question, because trauma settles so deep in a person. Is it possible to ever get over trauma?
I would say yes, absolutely.
Absolutely.
But
Now,
getting over trauma doesn't mean that you don't remember, right? You can remember, but not have the same physical or emotional reaction to the experience of remembering, the triggering. That doesn't have to happen, but you have to do the work to bring that emotional sensitivity under your mindful control. Absolutely, it's possible.
Thank you. And then this last question, and I'm going to pick on Dr. Logan about this, because he is a father and he has a young daughter. One of the questions is, how do we help children with their fear of police?
Well, you want to let them know that there's good and bad cops, right? I don't think we ever want to, have our kids believe that, the police are all bad, right? So first, just be honest with them. You have good people and you have bad people. Some of them happen to be police officers. And I think you discuss their feelings about what's going on in the world in a real way. Don't sugarcoat what's going on. Being mindful of your child's age, right? So how you approach a situation with an 8-year-old and what information you share with them might be very different than how you approach it with a 14-year-old and what information you might share with them. So that's number two. And number three, be open to whatever your kids feel or want to say about what's going on in the world, because they hear things in school, they see things on the news and might not necessarily say anything to you about it, might harbor these fears of police and might not say anything to you about it. But and number four, ask them. If they're not saying things to you directly, ask them about what's going on in the world. Have you heard anything about this in school? What's the school talking about? What are your classmates talking about George Floyd, right? To see if they even know what that is, right? Or who he was or what happened. So solicit information from your kids as well to see what they know and how they're dealing with what they know and what's going on in our world.
Thank you, Dr. Logan. So
Yes, ma'am.
that wraps up our conversation. I'm going to turn it over to Bishop, but I first would like to thank our moderator and our panelists. You all were amazing. And I hope that everyone attending, I know that they are leaving with something that they did not have or know before they got on this. So that for us is success. And so I, again, want to personally thank you all. I know Bishop is going to think, but you all I have a personal connection. And so you have outdone yourself, all three of you, right? And so we appreciate you giving your service. And thank you. Bishop?
Amen. Thank you, Kim. And again, thank you, Doctors Dawson, Logan, and Buffy. We really appreciate this. And so we're going to talk further, and we may be calling you back because there are so many things that we weren't able to discuss tonight. And I knew that it was probably going to be a two-time meeting. So we'll talk further. And if you guys are available, we'd love to resume this because there's still some issues related to trauma and racism and the political environment and some other things that we want to touch on. So again, God bless you all. Wish you the best in all of your endeavors as you move forward during this season. And so we speak blessings upon each of your practices. I know that things have been different. I can relate. I'm a professional too, and so it's been very difficult and different, but it's been enlightening, and I've learned a lot. And so I know that even as the church is coming back together, I really appreciate the comments that were made as far as the church reopening and making sure that that we have the church more protocol CDC friendly. I think that will help as people are coming back. So I really appreciate this evening. And so we're going to close this out now just in a word of prayer. Father, we bless you. We thank you for this day. We thank you for this evening. We thank you for these doctors, these professionals that have come to just share with us so that we would be enlightened and that our lives can be the better as we deal with various stressors and traumatic events that may come in our lives, that we can deal with them appropriately and that we can move from there to better in our lives. And so we give you all the glory. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, you guys go in peace.
Thank you.
Bye.